Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you have a water and a brownie from out in foyer. It's a very fancy foyer. I should call it foyer. Welcome, everybody. I'm David Blight. I direct the Gilda Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery and Abolition. We are thrilled to co-sponsor this event, this three-part comparison with the Fortunoff Center for Holocaust testimonies. This is at least the third event, I think now, I'm losing count, that we've done with Fortunoff, and we will do more for teachers, for the public, for Yale folks, and for real people everywhere. We have as many as 200 signed up on the live stream. So welcome everybody out there in Zoom world. Happy Thursday afternoon. This is an extraordinary comparative history we're going to attempt to do in two panels, one with scholars and then one with secondary teachers. At least two of those teachers have, I believe, already arrived. The third is on the way. They have to work until 4 o'clock, you know, not like us academics. Anyway, I want to say a quick word about what we do here. The Gilda Lehrman Center exists to do what Yale does, which is to create knowledge and to teach, and in our case, about the ancient and current story of slavery and abolition and its myriad legacies across all borders and all time. We sponsor the Frederick Douglass Book Prize, best book in English on those subjects every year. We do all kinds of panels, conferences, teacher institutes. They are especially keen to continue working on our outreach to teachers. We've been doing that for years, and hence that's why half of this symposium is with classroom secondary teachers. This is a difficult but rewarding subject, especially when you put it in comparative context. I had the privilege to spend a year as a Fulbrighter at the University of Munich about, oh God, I don't want to say how many years ago, but it was right after the Berlin Wall went down. So that gives you a hint. And it was a remarkable time to be in what was the two Germanys, with the wall opening up. And I spent a fair amount of that year traveling around to East Germany, working with teachers, actually. My job was always to lecture to them about the American Civil War. In fact, they were actually showing Ken Burns's documentary film on German television as I was there, dubbed, everything dubbed into German. It was weird. One female voice and one male voice dubbing all of it. So I got a lot of questions about that film, but also a lot of comparative conversations, which at that point were different in East Germany than they were in the West. Much has changed since then, for better or for worse. We're putting these three painful but important stories in conversation. The Nuremberg rules, the rise of Nazism, the racial regime created by Nazism, the apartheid regime rooted in law and practice in South Africa, and the Jim Crow system with its roots back in slavery and its development throughout the late 19th, early 20th century in the United States. I'm going to simply introduce in pretty brief terms two people who we'll hear from very shortly, and then turn it over to Dan Magaziner. Actually, three people I want to introduce. The first is Aya Martik, who is she's a fellow at the Macmillan Center, research fellow at the Macmillan Center. She is head of curriculum and education at the Fortunoff Center. And our comrade in planning this entire conference. Thank you, Aya, for everything you do and for pulling this together with my colleague, Michelle Zaks, our associate director at the GLC. Stephen Nairn, from whom we will hear in a moment, who I believe is in London. We have people all over the world who will be speaking with us. I believe one is in Berlin, one is in London, and one is in Atlanta. I may be wrong about that, but they're all going to be here. At any rate, Steve Nairn is, of course, the director of the Fortunoff Center, the Video Archive of Holocaust Testimony, one of Yale's most famous and important collections. He's in Vienna because he's currently working with the Wiesenthal Center for Holocaust Studies in Vienna. I think the Fortunoff testimonies have been linked up with the Wiesenthal Center for a long time, but he's there now, as I understand it, making all sorts of other connections all around Europe, because all of the testimonies are now digitized and therefore useful across the planet. When I first became aware of the Fortunoff stuff, it wasn't digitized. In fact, when I first became aware of everything, it wasn't digitized. And I still don't know what's digitized. Anyway, Steve has worked as an archivist, librarian for at least 20 years. He first was educated at the Universität Berlin. He then at the Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism. And he's run the Fortunoff archive now, I believe, 12 years. We connected, especially during the pandemic, and doing, actually just before, I think, but especially during the pandemic, and doing webinars, programs for your teacher institutes, and hence this ongoing wonderful relationship between our two centers. Now, I want to also briefly introduce Dan Magaziner, who will take over and moderate our first panel. Dan is my colleague in the history department. He is an expert on the history of South Africa. He did his PhD at Wisconsin, a notable thing. I did mine there too. And you may or may not know that Wisconsin had one of the first history departments that seriously did African history in the United States, back in the days of Phil Curtin and others. When I was a graduate student there in American history, we had to take a minor field. They don't make our students do that anymore. But I did mine in African history. I took 4 courses in African history. Great Africans and great collections. I probably wouldn't have stayed in African history, but I considered it at one point until I realized how many languages. So I didn't. But anyway, Dan has written 2 books and has 2 more underway. One of them is The Law and the Prophets, Black Consciousness in South Africa from 1968 to 1977. The second is called The Art of Life in South Africa. That was published in 2016. He's working on 2 new books now that are a combination of intellectual history and the history of art. And he's, I must say, too, a remarkable citizen in the history department. He's always running some committee. He's always DUS. He's always something, and still gets his books written. So with that, I welcome all of you here in the room. We're in, by the way, those of you out in the universe, we're in the recently remodeled, what is this room called? I couldn't hear you. It's the memorabilia room. Well, it's got a lot of stained glass windows. Sorry? The lecture hall in Sterling Library. Those of you who know Sterling Library, it's on the Wall Street side. Welcome in the Zoomverse, and welcome to all of you here in the room. With that, I'm going to turn it over. Oh, by the way, we think everybody who's going to be on Zoom is indeed connected finally. We had some nervousness about that, so stay tuned. And Steve Nairn will be our next speaker. Steve, there you are. Are you indeed in London?
It's true. I'm in
Okay.
London. I'm right across the street from King's Cross. So I apologize. I can't be there in person. And I will I will be very brief, but I'm honored to be here and to be a part of this ongoing effort, this cooperation between the Fortunoff Video Archive and the GLC. I think I also need to thank everyone, in particular at the GLC, Michelle and David and Daniel, for all the work you do every day. In particular, the work you're doing with teachers who are working with these quite difficult topics on a daily basis. This is the third event, you're right, that we have done together. They all seem to take place in May. We did one in May of 2021, which focused on the lived experience of slavery, contemporary and more distant past. We did a second event that took a comparative look at racial regimes, seeking similarities and differences between Jim Crow South, apartheid in South Africa, and the racial policies in the 30s. And that was held in May of 22. And here we are again, thanks to you and Michelle and Aya, to once again discuss these topics, but from a different angle, the angle of struggle and resistance, which I think is a logical evolution that builds on the previous events that I just mentioned. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the archive, just a few words about the collection. It began in 1979 in New Haven as a grassroots community effort led by volunteers, survivors, and fellow travelers. Some of these founders included Laurel Vlock, who was a television personality at Channel 8, Dory Laub, a psychiatrist and child survivor, and representatives from the local survivor community, such as William Rosenberg, a survivor from Częstochowa, Poland, who would become the head of the nonprofit that was formed to do this recording work called the Holocaust Survivors Film Project. And then, of course, Professor Jeffrey Hartman, who really was responsible for bringing this collection to Yale in 1981, when he deposited the first 180 some testimonies. And since then, he served as the archive's faculty advisor until his death in 2016. And it was under Jeffrey's watch that this collection really grew into the internationally renowned collection that it is, with over 4,400 testimonies of survivors and witnesses of the Holocaust in over 20 different languages, recorded in over a dozen countries, 12,000 hours of video material. But beyond this incredible effort, this ingathering of life stories, the archive really also established a model for other groups who were struggling to document their own experience of mass violence and atrocity from the bottom up, from a grassroots model. And I think that's a major contribution, and one that I also think grounds us in the work we're doing today with this comparative lens. It's from the very beginning, the survivors themselves were, in their testimonies, will point out in part their motivation for giving testimony could be driven by the current events, the current atrocities, mass violence, racism that was occurring around them at that time, inspired them in some cases to step forward and give testimony. So I think that connects us to this type of work. And this rootedness, we were very rooted in the survivor community. They not only led the project, they funded the project, they arranged tapings, they held organizational meetings in their homes. And this involvement with the survivors from the very beginning really has had an enormous impact on how we do the work we do. And the goal from the start was, first and foremost, to listen to survivors and to provide them with an opportunity to be heard by what is often referred to as an empathic listener. Professor Hartman wrote, and I can't say this better than he, wrote that the purpose of the Fortunoff Archive was, quote, to document the tragedy, to show it in its full human detail. We listen to them, try to free their memories, and see each person as more than a victim, as someone who faces those traumas again, an eyewitness who testifies in public. The archive now contains thousands of testimonies, as I said, and many of these individuals experienced and discussed in great detail the experience of forced labor, slave labor, the visceral impact of racial regimes, stories of resistance in all its various forms. So I believe that it is both logical and important for the Fortunoff Video Archive to be a part of this discussion today, and discussions like this, both here on campus and beyond, looking across space and time, comparatively analyzing different ideologies, variations in praxis, and disparate racial regimes that can provide important insights that can help us better understand the how and the ever elusive why of the Holocaust. Our faculty advisor, Tim Snyder, wrote that these kinds of comparisons are essential. And I'll quote him. He said that making analogies, I quote, is not some mysterious operation. It's how we think. Every time someone asks you for advice about a situation beyond your personal experience, or every time you're faced with an unfamiliar choice, your mind makes analogies with what you do know. Then you ask questions that allow you to clarify similarities and differences. At some point, you have made some, you understand things and you can act. And really, according to Tim, this idea of never again is nothing other than an invocation of that process. So the Fortunoff Archive sees the event today, our past cooperation with GLC, very much in line with this core mission to try to understand the tragedy of the Holocaust in its full, again, human detail. It's not some kind of challenge to the uniqueness of the Holocaust as a historical event or novum, but it's based in a fundamental understanding that only through comparative analysis, also through comparative analysis, new important insights can emerge. So with that, I want to thank you all again for coming, both in person and online, and I'll hand things over to Dan.
Great, thank you. Now, can you all hear me? Okay, so thank you all for being here and welcome, both those of you who are in the room. I'm Dan Magaziner. I'm a professor of history here at Yale. I work on 20th century South Africa. As David says, I'm going to be the moderator for this first panel today. Just a bit of logistics. So we are very lucky that Professor Robert Vincent is joining us in person, and Professors Amani Perry and Mark Roseman are not able to be here in person, but will be joining us on Zoom. So we are going to begin with Professor Vincent, and then I will have a shot over here so we can enjoy the presentations. Now this panel is comparative, and it is going to ask us to extend beyond the specific historical context of these grassroots struggles against racial regimes to try to understand and comprehend methods of organization and modes of resistance. And so we are going to get deep into historical context and then try and draw a connective thread. The panel is also going to take us in a somewhat unexpected and unconventional direction, because we're going to first move forwards in time, then we're going to double back and go back in time. There's a logic to this, I think, which is that both Professor Vincent and Professor Perry's presentations focus on the post-World War II context in South Africa, transnationally between South Africa and the United States, and in the United States, which means that they are both thinking about the legacy of Nazi Germany and the ways in which activists developed a rhetoric of comparison that learned from the experience of Nazi genocide and then transcended national boundaries to try and establish some sort of common rhetoric of resistance. So we're going to go from South Africa to the United States. We're going to go from the 1940s to the 1980s, and then we're going to double back to the experience that Professor Roseman will be speaking about. But while focusing on the post-World War II context, I think it's very imperative that we not neglect what Aimé Césaire very famously argued in Discourse on Colonialism, that Nazi Germany's state racism was in many respects the application in Europe of practices that Europeans had long imposed on the colonized world. And why I mention this is because although we are focusing on the post-World War II period, it's really important that we remember that as long as there had been enslavement, as long as there had been indigenous genocide and colonialism, there had been resistance. There had been grassroots activism. there had been organization within and across communities to try and fight back against these powerful regimes. This happened centuries before World War II in what becomes the United States and what becomes South Africa. So when we look at these chapters in our story, the post-World War II chapters, we are seeing just episodes in what was a much longer epic. So I'm going to introduce each panelist before their presentation. We will then have a couple questions. We'll see if we have time for those. We were really interested in hearing from you all, so we'll make sure to save time and take precedence for the questions that will come from you or from our audience online rather than from me. Our first presenter, sitting to my right here, is Robert Trent Vincent, who is director and chair of the Carter G. Woodson Institute for African American and African Studies at the University of Virginia, as well as a research associate at the Stellenbosch University in Stellenbosch, South Africa. He's the author of 2 books, Americans Are Coming, Dreams of American Negro Liberation and Segregationist South Africa, which was published in 2012, and Out Lutuli, Mandela Before Mandela, published in 2018. He currently serves as president for the Association of the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora, which is the world's premier organization of African and African diaspora scholars. He earned his PhD from Howard University and taught at Washington University in St. Louis and William before coming to UVA. His presentation today is entitled From South Africa to the South Bronx, Transnational Anti-Apartheid Politics in the Age of Decolonization. Professor Vincent.
We'll test this. Can you hear me in the room?
Yes.
Yes, and hopefully folk online, can we get a thumbs up?
Okay.
One way or the other, but I'll speak up if it's not loud enough. So thank you to everyone here at the Gilda Lehrman Center. Dan, David, Steve, Michelle, Melissa, for helping with travel arrangements. It's wonderful to be here. I'm happy to go first, one, because I don't have to follow Imani Perry, who is just a dynamic speaker. I'm sure Mark is too, but I've seen Imani in action. So I'm glad that I'm not following her. So thank you for coming. I'm very much interested in hearing the second panel as well, and just interacting and engaging on these topics. So this paper is connecting South African anti-apartheid and U.S. civil rights struggles within a transnational anti-apartheid activism. And I'm going to anchor this talk. We only have about 20 minutes or so. I'm going to anchor this talk around 4 individuals. Albert Lutuli, Africa's first Nobel Peace Prize winner and the president of the African National Congress, which was the leading anti-apartheid organization. Martin Luther King Jr., who we all know, I think. And if you don't, we're all in trouble. Miriam Makeba, South African exiled singer for 30 years from South Africa, and Africa Bambaataa, one of the founders of hip hop and the Universal Zulu Nation. And so moved from South Africa to the US and then back to South Africa. And I may not be able to cover everything in the 20 minutes, but we'll get Q&A. Okay, so first, Albert Lutuli, Mandela Before Mandela. And so many are not aware of Albert Lutuli, partially because he died tragically, suddenly in 1967. But if you can imagine the Nelson Mandela that walked out of prison in 1990 and articulated the politics of reconciliation and an imagination of a different kind of post-apartheid state building, that's Albert Lutuli 30 years early. Right? So Albert Lutuli, African National Congress president from 1952 to 1967, the first African-born recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize. And this was the first year in 1960 that human rights explicitly within the Nobel Peace Prize domain. And he won this Nobel Peace Prize connecting South Africa's anti-apartheid struggle to the growing human rights campaigns born from 1948 United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. Lutuli was born in 1902. He was a Zulu man, the Zulu are the largest ethnic group in South Africa, and also a devout Christian, but his Christianity was revolutionary. He saw no contradiction and his Christianity, his engagement in politics. He was a student and then a teacher with the American Board, an American missionary organization that established itself in 1834 in what became South Africa. And he became also a government chief, primarily representing his people as an advocate against segregations and then later apartheid South African government regimes. For his political activism, he was eventually stripped by the government of that chieftainship and the loss of salary, which 9 kids, was a pretty serious sacrifice to make. But given that sacrifice in 1952, he was elected by his peers as the president of the ANC. I think we all have a broad understanding of apartheid. I'll just say very quickly that apartheid was a political project enacted by the National Party. It ran from 1948 to 1994. It was building on earlier forms of land dispossession, colonial conquest, racial slavery, and forms of racial segregation that were broadly akin to U.S. Jim Crow. And those histories go back to 1652. The initiators of apartheid are primarily a group of people known as Afrikaners. And these are primarily descendants from the Netherlands, but also some from what is now Germany, but primarily the Netherlands. And their arrival beginning in 1652 and their successive reproduction in South Africa eventually comes to the name Afrikaner, meaning in their language, Afrikaans, a Dutch-based language, means African. And so this idea of Afrikaners in their very identity suggesting that they are Africans in the sense they are not that going to go back and forth, but they are stay. So they have a sense of permanence. They have a sense that the stakes are very high for them, being a minority numerically in South Africa, about a little less than 10% in South Africa at this time in 1948. So they have a sense of an embattled, persecuted minority by 2 different groups, broadly speaking. One, primarily English born and descended whites who arrived beginning roughly in 1800 and enacted their own forms of colonialism and ultimately defeated the Afrikaners in the South African War between 1899 and 1902. So Afrikaners came to the table and enacted the project of apartheid, primarily seeing themselves as part of a larger white racial group, but also as a distinct ethnic, as Afrikaners distinct vis-a-vis from British descended peoples. Not loud enough? Okay, let me get a little closer. Okay, don't want to get too close, I'll eat them. So just as that quick background then, so here are Afrikaners coming to the fore, regaining in their minds a political power that they felt had been lost in South Africa War in 1902. So they come to the fore as trying to enact a form of broad white racial supremacy, but also specific Afrikaner nationalism they want to advance. So that's anti-British, and it's also anti-African. And African peoples are about 80% of the population at this time, comprising of several different ethnic groups, the Zulu being the largest, and then the Xhosa, and then several others. And then so by the demographic majority and the active politics of many Africans, apartheid is enacted as an anti-African project. And so in 1948, the National Party, the Party of Apartheid, come to power. And they have broad objectives. This apartheid project over the decades. It is not linear in a direct way. There are factions within the National Party, but broadly speaking here, the broad objectives: a belief in racial purity and separation. And that shows up in various laws, the Population Registration Act of 1950, which designates different distinct racial groups in South Africa and essentially assigns differentiated privileges in economics, housing, education, politics, et cetera. Those persons of mixed race, if you will, or of regarded as different races, right? And you have Africans, this mixed race group of people called coloreds, Indians from the subcontinent of India, and also colors in all four there. So, but these are the official categories. So persons of different racial groups were not allowed to marry each other. This was the Mixed Marriages Act of 1949. And perhaps you would say, well, just get married if you are racist. Well, if you're having sexual relations or even cohabiting, then you went afoul of the Immorality Act that came in the following year. So that's just a few of the laws. There were many, many, many. So racial purity and separation was one broad objective. Eliminating Black political resistance and denying Black political citizenship claims were another primary objective. And we see this primarily in the suppression of communism in 1950, where communism is defined so broad that any dissent really against the apartheid regime can be classified as communist. A third broad objective was controlling African workers, their mobility, their both economic mobility, but also their simple mobility to move around, particularly urban centers. And that is done by pass laws, where Africans have to carry passes. They look kind of like your passport, but they really restrict where you can live, where you can move. They're tied to curfew laws. And many Africans are ejected from urban spaces because they're only expected to be in urban spaces in order to work. And so the idea is that Africans' natural home are in rural, tribal areas, and that they're only coming to urban areas to work, right? In white industry or in the mines or factories, what have you, right? And so their presence in urban areas are tightly controlled. And here's a fundamental contradiction of apartheid. African urban migration to urban centers is absolutely fundamental to the development of the South African economy. That is gold mining, diamond mining, and industrial work. But at the same time, Africans are regarded as the tribal, rural people who are not supposed to be resident in urban areas. And so the pass laws, the creation of residential zones called townships, are designed to create this segregated and subordinated space to try to resolve fundamental contradictions that's never resolved. So Africans are coming to urban areas to work, but their very presence in the body is very threatening. So the fifth broad objective is controlling Black education. And ultimately, the state takes over education from those mission societies, the ones like Aberlatuli had attended. And essentially, this was education for subordination, right? This was simply to provide enough education, just enough education for Africans to have basic literacy, to be able to take orders from the boss, but no more. No aspiration to be a professor. The fifth broad objective was controlling information, both coming into the country and what was going out of the country. And so there was, for instance, censorship laws that prevented news or attempted to prevent news of, let's say, for instance, the US for decolonization efforts happening around the world. At the same time, the South African government is very much engaged in its own propaganda campaign of suggesting that apartheid was not an evil per se, a political evil, but actually a solution to the thorny problem of multiracialism. That the presumption was that if you have multiple races, then there had to be conflict if they were in proximity with each other. So there was a very pessimistic approach that did not believe that folk of so-called different races could live in harmony in any way. And by their very proximity, conflict was inevitable. So this apartheid project of separation and subordination in a hierarchical way was broadcast to the world as a form of good neighborliness, as a solution, and ultimately as South Africa's own unique variant of decolonization that was happening across the African continent and in other parts of the world. Now, the apartheid regime was powerful enough domestically, but it also had powerful international allies. And the Cold War context is really important here, because during the Cold War, the United States deepened its diplomatic, economic, political, and military ties with South Africa, a critical source of uranium and other strategic minerals needed for the nuclear arsenal at the heart of its arms race with the Southern Union. So the US, along with Great Britain and France primarily, uses veto power on the United Nations Security Council to block any anti-apartheid resolutions from the UN General Assembly. And this became particularly troublesome, if you will, particularly in the late 1960s, as more African and Asian countries are getting their independence. They're joining the UN. And so these countries have a majority bloc in the General Assembly, and they're able to pass a variety of anti-apartheid resolutions. But with few exceptions, those permanent members who sat on the Security Council, and that included the US, Great Britain, and France, could veto any anti-apartheid legislation coming from the General Assembly. And so in these ways, then, anti-apartheid activism within the country and outside the country was often frustrated on the international scale. So coming back to Luthuli, thinking about how Luthuli and other anti-apartheid activists are thinking through the problem of apartheid, right? Apartheid for them is no solution. They have an idea of a post-apartheid reality or freedom dream of what South Africa could be. And so Luthuli is also thinking about the fact that South Africa is a multiracial society, but is very optimistic compared to the apartheid regime. He does truly believe that all races can live together in South Africa, and actually looks at South Africa, if it can overcome the problem of apartheid, as a model for the rest of the world dealing with its own racial problems around the world. And so here we talk about transnational solidarities then. Most of my work is transnational as opposed to comparative. And so I'm going to continue in that vein. And so to counter the apartheid regime and its powerful national allies, Luthuli sought to deepen existing transnational ties between Black South Africans and diasporic Blacks, particularly African Americans and Afro-Caribbeans. And he's tapping into a longer history that goes back to the 19th century, where Black South Africans and diasporic Blacks were moving back and forth across the Atlantic. They were coming together in interpersonal ways, institutional ways, in religion, particularly with the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the AME, which established many, many branches in South Africa beginning in the 1890s. There were also African American Baptist churches and denominations in South Africa as well, also in the 1890s. We also see this with several hundred Black South African students going to American universities beginning again in the 1870s and carrying forward. There were no institutions of higher education for Black South Africans until 1915, the University of Fort Hare, and even then, that was sort of tightly controlled. That was created as a way to stop the transnational flow of Black South African students primarily HBCUs like my alma mater, Tuskegee. Booker T. Washington loomed large as a model of Black success. And also schools like Yale, Columbia, University of Michigan. We also see this in political movements, particularly the Garvey. Jamaican Marcus Garvey, whose Universal Negro Improvement Association had headquarters here in New York, but spread all over the world. So Luthuli coming to America in 1948, June 1948, just a month after the May 1948 election that brought us apartheid. He's here for 7 months giving a speaking tour. He's speaking to churches, civic groups, youth groups, and universities that in this trip, primarily through the US South, really expands his domestic view of South African racism, to consider that in concert with what he's witnessing and experiencing in the US, North and South. His tour also coincided with the 1948 American presidential campaign that featured the Dixiecrat revolt of Southern segregationists against the relatively mild civil rights agenda of the incumbent president, Harry Truman. So displaying these strong racial affinities and solidarities between some Black South Africans and African Americans, Luthuli visits during this tour historically Black universities, Howard, Atlanta University, Tuskegee, and Virginia State. And he remarked, quoting, "I have such a great desire to visit my people in the South that I would have been awfully disappointed to return to Africa without doing so." As he goes to these universities, he lectures on African history and culture. And you know, at most of these universities, there are no formal courses on African history. So he's a sensation. He's an African man who very learned, who is offering these histories and some insight on African cultures. He's also speaking to the virtues of Gandhi and nonviolence. As we know, Gandhi had first worked out his ideas of satyagraha in South Africa. And Gandhi still had relatives, a son who was still in South Africa at this time. So Luthuli is looking at freedom struggles around the world, including the Indian struggle against British colonialism, as potential models for what can happen in South Africa. Now, of course, he's experiencing Jim Crow personally, right? And so he's traveling on Jim Crow trains. He's encountering segregated public facilities. One example in Petersburg, Virginia, a white proprietor refused to allow Luthuli and his Virginia state host Samuel Gandy to eat on the premises. Now, informed that Luthuli was not an African American, the proprietor promptly continued to Jim Crow against Samuel Gandy, an African American professor, but deemed Luthuli an honorary white and thus able to dine at the facility. So, of course, at this moment, then Luthuli and Gandhi are exasperated by this lead. But you see this dynamic of honorary whites. And by the way, this also happened with African Americans coming to what became South Africa in the 1890s. They were often classified as honorary whites and thus exempt from the segregation laws that were impacting Black South Africans. So the same thing is happening on this side of the water. Right, so this sort of domestic framing of racism targeted to domestic Blacks, but somehow Blacks from outside these domestic borders are regarded as honorary whites and thus exempt. So in Atlanta, Luthuli meets with the famed pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church, Martin Luther King Sr. And I believe that this is the first time that he meets a young Morehouse graduate who had just graduated, a 19-year-old Martin Luther King Jr. Be more about their relationship, but I believe it begins here. The larger point, the personal experiences, the lived experiences with U.S. Jim Crow, in addition to what he already knew about the United States, enables Luthuli to ultimately contextualize South Africa's freedom struggles to a global color line that included decolonization and labor movements in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, and the U.S. Civil Rights Movement. So Luthuli brings these experiences into his politics. He is a national political figure in the iconic 1952 Defiance Campaign, which was a multiracial mobilization led by the ANC. The campaign modeled itself on Gandhi's nonviolent civil disobedience strategies that, as I mentioned, helped win India's independence from Great Britain. And Luthuli endorsed Gandhi's ideas of satyagraha, believing that Africans, Indians, whites, colored, people of all races could mobilize together. And he had to convince Gandhi's own son, Manilal, who still lived in South Africa, that this was possible. So Gandhi's own son, Manilal, did not believe that his father's principles could be applied by Africans. He, like his father in an earlier time, regarded Africans as a lesser order, a lesser civilized order. And so he had to convince Gandhi's own son that this multiracial organizing was possible. So the Defiance Campaign was civil disobedience against these apartheid laws that I mentioned earlier. Over 9,000 people of all races went to jail for defying these apartheid laws. And this multiracial organizing flew in the face of the apartheid regime's presumptions that a grouping of multiracial peoples would automatically lead to conflict. So they're modeling in their activism what they want a post-apartheid South Africa to be. Now, the Defiance Campaign does not eliminate apartheid laws, but it does lead to a dramatic increase in ANC membership from a reputed 25,000 in 1951 to a claimed 100,000 at the end of the campaign in January of 1952. And Lutuli is also leading not only the ANC, but an ANC-led Congress alliance of different organizations composed of different racial groups. The Congress Alliance also authors ultimately the Freedom Charter, a landmark 1955 document, demanded freedom, justice, and material equity for all South Africans. It was regarded as the South African Declaration, again, building on this human rights tradition that begins essentially with much of the impetus coming from the growing realization of all the atrocities with Nazi Germany. Lutuli is also advancing strategies of international nonviolence. And this is his language, with repeated calls to the United Nations and its member nations, particularly South Africa's strongest Western allies, Great Britain and the United States, to apply strong pressure on South Africa through political isolation, economic sanctions, arms embargoes, and boycotts of South African goods. In 1958, it called for a global boycott of all South African goods, helped develop early anti-apartheid movements in several countries, including Ireland, Great Britain, throughout Scandinavia, the Netherlands, India, the US, and Ghana. Inspired by this, global anti-apartheid activists coordinated closely with the South African domestic struggle and with the exiled ANC, broadening the terrain for sanctions beyond economics to other sectors like sports, culture, and higher education. Against views that economic sanctions would be counterproductive because they would most hurt economically vulnerable Black South Africans, Lutuli argued soberly, the economic boycott of South Africa will entail undoubted hardship for Africans. We do not doubt that. But if it is a method which shortens the day of blood, the suffering to us will be a price we are willing to pay. In any case, we suffer already. Our children are often undernourished, and on a small scale, so far, we die at the whim of peace. Now, this tactic, the combination of domestic activism and calls for international sanctions, would continue to grow episodically, again, not linear, but by the 1980s, domestic resistance escalating, combined with a burgeoning global anti-apartheid movement, will be two factors that contribute to bringing the apartheid regime to the negotiating table in 1990, and ultimately leading to the end of apartheid in 1994. So let me move forward. How am I doing on time? Move forward? Yes, move forward. So let's bring King into the story now. Okay, so Dr. King was one of Lutuli's many global admirers. King also became a fellow Nobel Peace Prize winner, 1964, and an anti-apartheid crusader. And while, if we ever do think of King and Lutuli in the same frame, we often think of King and Lutuli. But in King's, it was reversed. King had met Lutuli as a 19-year-old in his father's church and his father's house. King had watched the Defiance campaign develop. He was attracted to Lutuli's articulation of nonviolent civil disobedience. And along with other inspirations, Howard Thurman, Ed Rustin, Lutuli was also an important mentor for King. Now, en route to the Oslo ceremony in 1964 for his Nobel Peace Prize, King stopped in London to give an address. This was the title, An Address on South African Independence. In the audience sat citizens of Lutuli's continent, his exiled compatriots, and human rights advocates from India, Pakistan, the West Indies, and the US. King opened by connecting the global color line from America to apartheid South Africa. He said, quoting, "Clearly there is much in Mississippi and Alabama to remind South Africans of their own country. With those in the far more deadly struggle who strove for half a century to win by nonviolent methods before the shootings of Sharpeville and all that has happened since. And most of us know that in 1960, there was this horrible massacre, March 1960, where at least 69 Africans were murdered and 180 were injured at least. And this was in protest of those past laws mentioned earlier. So on December 10th, excerpts from King's London address were broadcast to regale the Nobel Peace Prize audience with the parable of soaring in the flight of Albert Lutuli, who he evokes. Now, he evokes Lutuli by name in that acceptance speech, but he made a cardinal sin. He did not think his wife in the course of that speech. So, Celeste, whoever you're partnered with, make sure that's the first order of business. Thank your wife. I'm sure you heard about that, the fact, but let me go on. I think, hopefully, he explained to Coretta that Albert Lutuli was such a significant person in his life that he was simply carried away by that. I don't think that right? Who was the most important person in his life? His wife, right? Of course. But I mention this because it gives us a little bit more insight on the esteem that King held for Lutuli. King and Lutuli worked together primarily through another anti-apartheid organization, the American Council on Africa. And here they're primarily working on UN Declaration of Human Rights Days in December, where they're really putting the spotlight on the apartheid regime and connecting it to struggles for racial justice around the world, decolonization movements around the world, including in the United States. So that's an ongoing partnership between Lutuli and King. King tries to go to South Africa in 1965, but was denied by the apartheid regime. He gives major speeches on South Africa, connecting it again to US civil rights. And in his 1967 book, Chaos of Community, King condemned the US for support of apartheid in South Africa, which he described as the new Nazi Germany. And that was a common refrain amongst anti-apartheid activists in the 50s, 60s, into the 70s, that South Africa was the heir of Nazi Germany. For King and Chaos Community, South Africa was, quoting, the classic example of organized and institutionalized racism, the incarnation of the doctrine of white supremacy, made possible, according to King, by more than $700 million of American capital and the billions of dollars in trade and the military alliances, which are maintained under the pretext of fighting communists in Africa. Now, Lutuli and King would die violently within a year of each other. In July of 1967, a train mortally wounded Lutuli in an incident that remains shrouded and mystery. He was killed by an oncoming train as he was crossing railroad tracks that he crossed virtually all of his life. There are still attempts by the family to investigate this. But we don't too, of course, in the next April, an assassin killed King. And that white man charged with the murder, James Earl Ray, considered emigrating too before he was caught to apartheid South Africa. We thought we could find refuge. Let me come to the close. I sense that over time, but I do want to mention Miriam Makeba, because Miriam Makeba is really important for our story too, because she, like Lutuli, is coming across the border from South Africa to America. Unlike Lutuli, she is coming in exile. Before her 1959 exile from South Africa, after appearing in the secretly filmed anti-apartheid film Come Back Africa, Makeba was part of a jazz group, the Manhattan Brothers. And that jazz and the name of the jazz group Manhattan Brothers also gives us a window in those transatlantic connections in music that date back to the 1910s that connect South Africa and America. And Come Back Africa, has anybody seen this film? It's a powerful anti-apartheid film that was filmed secretly in South Africa by a filmmaker named Ryan Lugosi. Unbeknownst to the South African regime, he went around engaging Black South Africans, and he wanted Black South Africans to tell firsthand testimonies of what apartheid was like. And so this secret film eventually smuggled out of the country was a hit throughout national film festivals, wherever it was shown in 1959, 1960, and beyond. Miriam Makeba had a 4-minute Academy in that film. And that film circulated around the world, also propelled her internationally. And it gained the attention of one Harry Belafonte, who has just departed us, who was moved not just by the power of singing and the stately, regal appearance there in Makeba, but the anti-apartheid struggle that she was a part of. And he facilitates her entrance into the United States. They become musical collaborators. They make several records together. One, An Evening with Belafonte and Makeba in 1965, wins a Grammy. Makeba is the first South African to win a Grammy. But they're also using their fame to tour the U.S. civil rights organizations, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And so they're touring to raise money for these civil rights organizations. So the artist is not just the artist, but the artist is an activist. So that relationship between Belafonte and Makeba is generative and powerful and exemplify those longstanding connections. Now, going further now, Makeba is speaking to the UN Special Committee against Apartheid in 1963 and 1964, giving firsthand testimonies about what it's like to live as a Black South African under apartheid. She also advocates for international sanctions and boycotting South African goods, following the position of King Mutuli and many others. She also, in 1968, a year after her top 5 hit Pata Pata in 1967, she marries the Black Power icon, Stokely Carmichael. And she was part of this constellation of activists. Carmichael, yes, but a range of activist artists like Belafonte, Sidney Poitier, Abby Lincoln, Nina Simone, Odetta, and Cicely Tyson, just to name a few. So again, artists, activists, linking US civil rights and South African anti-apartheid activism. The marriage to Carmichael, Black Power icon, increases government surveillance. Her recording contracts are canceled, her performing contracts are canceled, and they both go into exile to Guinea in 1968. She does not return to South Africa until 1990. Now, Makeba was also influential for a young man named Lance Taylor, who remembered hearing Makeba speak on the radio about apartheid South Africa throughout the 1960s. And this young man, Lance Taylor, grew up in the South Bronx. And Lance Taylor was reputed to be a member of a gang called the Black Spades. And we know something about the South Bronx in the 1970s. It's my birthplace. It was a desolate place, burnt out place. But out of this rubble came this vital form of music known as hip hop. Lance Taylor, inspired by Makeba, the stories of South Africa that he was hearing, and images of the Zulu, this large ethnic group, the Tulius one, that had the reputation of being martial warriors, disciplined, icons of nation building in the 19th century. Lance Taylor renames himself Africa Bambata, a Zulu anti-colonial chief. In 1906, he reworks the Black Spades into the Universal Zulu Nation, the first hip-hop collective that comes about in the world, that spreads around the world. It mirrors in many ways Garvey's UNIA and its global spread with chapters all over the world. So hip-hop with the 4 elements. Do we know them? Breakdancing, graffiti, rapping, DJing, 4 elements, and then Bambata adds a 5th, knowledge of self. And knowledge of self, born from his own understanding of South African histories, African American histories, placing them in a global frame. He creates these infinity lessons that's all about knowledge of self. He took college classes with none other than Herbert Acker, many of us might know. So what I'm sharing with you here is that to be a Zulu, to be a member of the Universal Zulu Nation in hip hop's early days was to be a strong, disciplined, knowledgeable, political person. Yes, hip hop is about having fun, but it's also about knowledge itself and being aware of struggles for racial justice around the world. So Bambaataa, we may know him as a musical icon, hits like Planet Rock and Looking for the Perfect Beat. And he uses his fame, musical fame, to also fundraise, like Cable, fundraise for anti-apartheid causes. And he cut several records and presided over several concerts, raising almost $100,000 for the AIDS. So this Universal Zulu Nation, as I mentioned, has chapters all over the world, including in South Africa. And we see the Universal Zulu Nation arriving in Cape Town in 1983. And we see here South African Universal Zulu Nation members looking at their situation in a place called the Cape Flats outside Cape Town, very desolate areas as well, very similar to the South Bronx, and they're making those connections, they're seeing the parallels, and they're engaging in their own domestic anti-apartheid activism toward the very end of apartheid. They're part of that grassroots activism, inspired by hip hop, particularly the Fifth Element, seeing that their struggles domestically are connected to large international struggles, particularly in America. And so I end my story, perhaps my too long story there, just to share with you these transnational connections of Black peoples in South Africa and in the US, often moving back and forth and across the water. And at the very least, having an understanding of their own domestic struggles, being able to place that in a larger context. These grassroots struggles, domestically based, yes, but internationally minded, anchored by individuals, institutions, and Zulu Nation. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Professor Vincent. I will now invite on Zoom, provided that the Zoom is functioning. Our next speaker is Imani Perry. Imani Perry is the Hughes Rogers Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University. She's the author of 7 books, including the 2022 New York Times bestseller, South to America, A Journey Below the Mason-Dixon to Understand the Soul of the Nation, which won the 2022 National Book Award for Nonfiction, as well as Looking for Lorraine, The Radiant and Radical Life of Lorraine Hansberry, which won the Penn Bograd Weld Award and the Lambda Literary Award for Nonfiction in 2019. Professor Perry's presentation is entitled Hansberry's America, Civil Rights, Anti-Colonialism, and Post-War Politics in the Life of an American Playwright.
All right. Can you all hear me? Okay, great. It is wonderful to be with you all. I apologize that it's virtual. So I want to start with A Raisin in the Sun, which I assume most people are familiar with, but I'll give you some basic details. A Raisin in the Sun makes it to Broadway in 1959. The author is a young Black American playwright, Lorraine Hansberry. It's the first play on Broadway written by a Black woman. She's the youngest winner of the Drama Critics Circle Award. And the play is a story of a family living on Chicago's South Side in a kitchenette apartment, deeply constricted, frustrated. The father of the family has died, however, leaving them with a life insurance check, which much of the family's hope hinges upon. And the big question of the play, there's various aspirations, but the big question of the play is whether they will be able to move into a house in a predominantly white neighborhood that we learn is covered by a racially restrictive covenant. And we'll come back to that. But I like to think about A Raisin in the Sun as a way of teaching this period in history and thinking about racial regimes and also the life of Hansberry. And so I'm going to try to give a window into how I think that might be approached just as a kind of thought exercise, but it's also an interesting pedagogical exercise. So this moment, 1959, we should think about the context, right? The society is changing, right? And this is part around the questions of race, and this is part of the legacy of World War II. Brown v. Board of Education has been decided in 1954. It declares Plessy versus Ferguson, the legal decision of 1896, which essentially legitimized Jim Crow as a legal order. Brown declares it unconstitutional. Schools cannot be legally segregated any longer. And this is, characteristic of the US South, but also many Midwestern states, if not by law, are de facto systematically segregated. The murder of Emmett Till in 1955. If Brown galvanizes people to think the federal government is finally going to be on the side, or the law is finally going to be on the side of civil rights, Emmett Till's murder galvanizes organizers to respond to the repeated and systematic racial violence that characterizes the Jim Crow South. You have 55, 56, the Montgomery bus boycott, which is ultimately successful, which brings Martin Luther King Jr. on a national stage. 1957, the desegregation of Central High in Little Rock, Arkansas, where the nation views the mob violence. They remember the first day of the attendance of the Little Rock Nine at Central High School. Elizabeth Eckford, the one child who winds up by herself because her home doesn't have a telephone. She doesn't know that the meeting place for the children who are desegregating the schools has changed. She comes to the front of the school. There's a mob of 400 people. This tiny girl is in tears. The nation is seeing the violence and the rage and the massive resistance to the promise of equality that is supposed to be signaled by Brown, right? So, and then the students go home for 2 weeks in Little Rock. They come back. Now there's a mob of 1,000 people. Remember, Eisenhower has to federalize the National Guard to protect the children throughout the school year, and nevertheless, they are faced with regular violence and insult and brutality. So, what's interesting about this is that Hansberry's play makes it to Broadway, and to a certain extent, this makes sense because civil rights are on people's minds. But it's not a play about the South. It is a play about Chicago. It is a play about people who have moved to the North as part of the Great Migration, like Hansberry's family. Her mother was from Tennessee. Her father was from Mississippi. And what A Raisin in the Sun illuminates and really makes quite clear to audiences is that the racial regime in the North, while not structured in a kind of Jim Crow order in the way that we classically see it, is also quite oppressive, right? So at the period, and this comes in part from Hansberry's own life, right? So the period in which she comes of age, she's born in 1930 in Chicago. The majority of the city of Chicago is covered by racially restrictive covenants, private land agreements that essentially exclude Black people from purchasing property. The impact of that in the post-war context is in part that not only is it the case that for many Black GIs who are coming back, they cannot take advantage of the educational benefits of the GI Bill because of legal segregation in state universities. But for those who are returning to northern cities, they cannot take advantage of the potential housing benefits because so much of the housing is actually by virtue of federal law as well as private land agreements inaccessible to them, right? We know this is the story of why in Chicago, for example, public housing is built up is because they can't build out because so little of the city is open to Black residents. Hansberry's father, Carl Hansberry, was actually a real estate mogul of sorts who actually created kitchenette apartments to house the migrants who were coming from the South. And he litigated to open up a neighborhood that was covered by a restrictive covenant. And this is an important detail. The case winds up all the way up to the Supreme Court. It's an important detail just to think about the context when Hansberry creates the story of A Raisin in the Sun, because she and her family moved into a house that had been formerly exclusionary. And when they moved in, they were subject to the kind of violence that was fairly customary in cities like Chicago and places also like Indiana, Cicero, Illinois, when there were efforts to desegregate them. There was a rock thrown through the window of their home that they occupied in a white neighborhood that narrowly missed Hansberry's head as a 7-year-old. That quite likely could have killed her had it connected. And she talked about how her mother had to stay up all night holding a pistol on her lap to defend the home while her father was litigating a case to try and stay in their home all the way up to the Supreme Court. So the point being that while there is a Jim Crow order in the South, there is this spatial segregation that is violently protected in northern cities like Chicago that Hansberry, in writing A Raisin in the Sun, hopes to capture. Right? And the play is very successful, right? And it ends, so they ultimately, and I won't go back over it, there are 3 film versions of it. And so if you haven't seen it, it's quite easy to see. And there's lots of interesting details, but in the interest of time, I wanna just move past an account of the play itself and think about the implications of insisting that the American public think of the question of race and racism in the United States in terms that include what was happening in northern cities. The frustration she experienced after the play becomes wildly successful and then is almost immediately made into a film version, is that there is this misperception that the play is a happy story, that when the family in the end is going to move into a predominantly white neighborhood, that that's a happy ending. When in fact, given her own experience and given the frequency of mob violence that occurred in response to desegregating neighborhoods in northern cities, it's far more likely that they're going to face pretty brutal retaliation for the move. And this misperception in many ways drove Hansberry's later work. So her 2 major subsequent plays, one which is now up on Broadway, again, it's The Sign in Sidney Brustein's Window, which is essentially the story of the disaffection of a Greenwich Village Jewish American intellectual activist who feels as though social movement is ultimately so easily co-opted that he can't believe in organizing any longer, and the story of his relationship. And there's lots of sort of beautiful sub-themes. And then the other, LeBlanc, is a story, one of the earliest plays that really treats the questions around decolonization in a fictional West African nation. And these are indicative of who Hansberry was and where she sits in the midst of movements in the mid-20th century, but also in the midst of a kind of complex set of political realities. So I'll just say a few things about sort of the beginning of her life and then where she goes after Raisin in the Sun and with these subsequent works. So Hansberry comes up in a sort of solidly middle class and really upper middle class Black world. She goes to several colleges, drops out a couple of times, and becomes part of the kind of left-wing artist scene, both in Greenwich Village and in Harlem. She's mentored by Paul Robeson as well as W.E.B. Du Bois. And as a member and as a young woman on the left who is involved in socialists and various Communist Party organizing, and as a mentee of these men who are ultimately blacklisted, Hansberry, as a young woman, has her passport revoked and winds up under FBI surveillance. So what's interesting is that so she's sort of caught up in the Cold War McCarthyist era. And what's interesting is when her play is initially successful, one of the worries of the FBI, and you can see it in their files, is that they don't want it to become apparent that they've been following her because there's a worry that it will actually lead to criticism of the agency. So the play is that successful that they actually are worried about being seen as targeting Hansberry. But they also say something interesting, which is they say there's no subversive content in the play. And so it is indicative of the way that something that will ultimately frustrate Hansberry is that in her effort to put together a realistic play, some of her politics are not readily apparent. Now, after she achieves extraordinary fame, she continues to be involved in political organizing that is responsive to the larger racial regime of the United States, but also the kind of international politic in the era of decolonization. So a couple of quick examples. So one, in 1960, in the context of the African airlift of students from East Africa that is part of the Kennedy administration's Cold War policy of wanting to bring African students to be educated in the United States as an effort to sway them in the sort of decolonization moment, to want to ally themselves with the West. Hansberry and Malcolm X are two of the people who lead the orientation for the students. And when I found this out initially, when I was writing about Hansberry, I thought, well, that's unusual, right? I'm sort of surprised about that decision. But in fact, the decision was made because those are the two people who the students wanted to meet and wanted to talk to about African-American life. Now, part of the interest, I assume, in Hansberry had one to do with her creation of a character who was really important in A Raised in the Sun, Joseph Osagai, who's a West African student who is a suitor of the young woman in the family, but who introduces the question of international Black politics in this kitchenette apartment in Chicago, right? And he's talking, so his sort of political perspective and his assertion that he believes in the religion of doing what is necessary in the world, in some ways is the ultimate expression of Hansberry in the play itself. And so there's this sense of connection between African Americans and West Africans in the moment of sort of civil rights protest and decolonization that she talks about in the play, or that she gestures at in the play. The other piece is that she is the niece of William Leo Hansberry, a longtime professor at Howard University, who has taught several generations of African students who have come to Howard University to study, a number of whom became active in independence movements and included people like Nnamdi Azikiwe, the first president of post-colonial Nigeria, and really the person who is credited with being the founder of African studies, right? Not as area studies, but African studies as such. That was Hansberry's uncle. And so he was sort of a direct connection to to anti-colonial politics on the continent and shaped Hansberry immensely, as did W.E.B. Du Bois, with whom she studied African history in New York at the Jefferson School of Social Science. So she's involved early on with the students who are African students who are coming to the United States. There's also a really important meeting in the history of the civil rights movement that she participates in. And I'm not going to go that far past making this point, but it's important to sort of think about how you take an individual story and sort of say something about a period in that through that story. So as a bit of context, Hansberry was a person who was critical of the civil rights establishment quite early, and critical even of her father, often saying, okay, you went through all this trouble to open up a house that was legally that Black people were prohibited from, a block that Black people were prohibited from living on. But after the fact, Chicago is still just as segregated. And she would say, even though Chicago doesn't have laws in place like they have in Mississippi, it was still a deeply unequal and segregated place. So she was skeptical of desegregation as an agenda for Black liberation. In 1954, if you look at the articles she was writing as a young journalist, she wasn't writing about Brown, she was writing about Kenya. She was interested in talking about what was going on with Jomo Kenyatta far more than what was going on in Topeka, Kansas. So, but something happens for her in the midst of the student movement. SNCC is founded in April of 1960. She's excited about the kind of organizing that the young people are doing. She sees it as much more sort of radical and bolder. And she's also excited when she sees what's happening in Birmingham, right? The kind of direct action protests that are happening in Birmingham. So set that aside for a moment. She's a close friend of James Baldwin. James, who is a very popular kind of interpreter of the moment. James Baldwin is called to a meeting at the home of Robert F. Kennedy, and he's asked to bring his friends, who include Lorraine Hansberry, Lena Horne, Clarence Jones, who's Martin Luther King Jr.'s lawyer, Jerome Smith, who was an organizer in a civil rights organization, CORE. They're called to the Kennedy home in New York. And the agenda initially is that Robert F. Kennedy is hoping to get them as sort of Black public figures to discourage Black people in Birmingham, which I'm particularly proud of because that's my home, from engaging in so much direct action protest. Remember, this is the children's crusade. This is kids going to jail. This is the dogs. This is the hoses. This is 1963. So he wants to get them to tell Black people in Birmingham to calm down. The meeting begins somewhat awkwardly. And Jerome Smith, who is a CORE activist who is in New York because he has to have eye surgery because he's been so brutally beaten while in Mississippi, finds himself frustrated by the meeting because, and you have to keep in mind, these organizers in the Deep South are not, as even though the federal government is aware of how brutally they're being treated, they are not being appropriately protected. And so he speaks out about their failure, the Kennedy administration's failure to appropriately protect civil rights workers. And RFK is kind of dismissive of Smith. He sort of like turns away from him. And this incenses Lorraine Hansberry. And what she begins to do is to really subvert the meeting. And she says, not only are we not going to try to get protesters in the South and organizers in the South to mediate, to quell, to be more quiet and gentle for your political interest, we want you actually to speak out much more strongly on behalf of civil rights. And she says to RFK, what we want from you is a moral commitment. on the question of civil rights. Stop playing politics with this. And she stands up famously, and everybody leaves the meeting. And the news reports the following days talk about how the meeting was a failure, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what's significant that I want to point out, there's lots of other interesting details, is that it is only after that meeting that you begin to get from the Kennedy administration the use of the language of civil rights as a moral question. Okay? It's also the case that Hansberry, though she was deeply invested in internationalist politics, begins to concentrate her energy increasingly on what is happening in the context of the Southern movement, seeing it as really the site of revolutionary potential in the United States. And among the things that she does, and I'll end on this note, is that she has a fundraiser in Croton-on-Hudson, which is the neighborhood in the Hudson Valley where she has her sort of summer home. It is known as a site for leftists and artists for several generations. She has a fundraiser for CORE there. And what they do with the money is purchase a car. And the car that they purchase winds up being the car that Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney were driving when they were murdered in Mississippi in 1964. Hansberry dies the next year of pancreatic cancer, but as she's dying, she's often talking about wishing that she could go south to see what kind of revolutionary she would actually be. And I think for me, what is the point of sort of focusing on her life is to actually understand that the question often of the way people were grappling with what did it mean to pursue freedom was both a hyper-local question, right? Where even simple things like exercising the right to vote could mean the end of your life, or desiring to exercise the right to vote. They were also national matters, right? And that meant whether or not the federal government was going to act on behalf of the support of the rights of people who had been historically discriminated against, but also federal agencies, whether we're talking about the Federal Housing Authority, and also the realm of private law. And it also was an international question where Black people in the United States saw their fates as connected with those of Black people around the world, and particularly around the colonized world. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Perry. So now it is time for our third and final panelist, also joining us on Zoom, where I believe he's in Europe, and so it's quite late. And so we appreciate him sticking up or staying up for us here. Mark Roseman is Distinguished Professor in History and the Pat M. Glazer Chair in Jewish Studies at Indiana University. His books include Lives Reclaimed, a story of rescue and resistance in Nazi Germany, published in 2019. Jewish Responses to Persecution, 1933 to 1946, Volume 1, in 2010. The Villa, the Lake, the Meeting, the Wannsee Conference, the Final Solution in 2002, and The Past in Hiding in 2000. He's the general editor of the 4-volume Cambridge History of the Holocaust, which is currently in preparation. And Professor Roseman's presentation is entitled Resistance, Rescue, and the Nazi Racial State.
Thanks so much. Can you hear me? Yeah. Oh, great. I too am very sorry that I can't be there, and also because it's so late, I fear that I will not be at the second panel, but I'm very honored to be part of this conference. In a moment, I'd like to introduce the actions of a small group of Germans who were involved in the rescue of some Jews, to sort of offer an in-depth example of what concrete opposition to Nazi racial policy might look like. But in the light of the other two papers, I just want to begin by sketching out some similarities, but some fundamental differences in the nature and possibilities of resistance in these different contexts. I mean, there's good reason on the face of it to consider resistance in Nazi Germany, the US, and South Africa altogether. They were all racist regimes that sought to subjugate and discriminate those seen as inferior. Though Nazi Germany was a dictatorship, like the others, it enjoyed a great deal of popular support, presenting resistance groups with the challenges of contending not just with the regime, but with the hegemonic groups within the society. And indeed, in the US case, society was as much a problem as the state. In the 1930s, the violence of the Nazi regime did not particularly stand out in relation to the kinds of things that we see in apartheid South Africa or in large parts of the US. Sure, there was a short, ferocious assault on opponents, 1933 to 34, when the Nazis came to power. But then for some years, the concentration camp population declines down to around 3,000 in the mid-30s. We know the US drew some inspiration for US racial measures, and certainly they were happy to cite the US states that include sterilization for those seen as inferior, or the number of lynchings that took place in the US to rebut criticisms of their racial policy. And as we've already heard, the example of the Holocaust after the war was very present in the minds of those engaged in civil rights and anti-racial struggle. Think of Paul Robeson invoking the new concept of genocide, a term formulated against the backcloth of the experience of the Holocaust. So there are lots of ways in which we can draw connections, and that was the logic, I think, behind this panel, this event. And indeed, one of the members of the little group that I'm looking at came to the US as an emigre in 1939 and actually was active in the civil rights movement after the war. But I do want to sort of emphasize the major differences also in terms when we're thinking about resistance. First of all, if we look at resistance, the actual resistance to the regime, it was not primarily about race. The initial efforts to take on the Nazis came from the left, from the working class movements, who saw the Third Reich above all as a sort of capitalist project to suppress labor. The socialists, communists, and the trade unions were the initial opponents, but they were very rapidly and brutally crushed, their leaders murdered or sent to concentration camps. So within a year, there was very little serious direct opposition to the Nazis still standing. During the war, the major resistance movements that emerge are from nations under Nazi rule. They're fighting for independence, not resisting racial policy as such, albeit many, of course, are antagonized by policies inflicted by the Nazis that reflect the Nazis' belief in their racial superiority. So serious resistance is rarely about Nazi race policy per se. And indeed, some very important participants in anti-Nazi resistance movements are, for example, highly anti-Semitic. There are voices, and the White Rose student movement is famously so illustrated on the poster that sort of advertised this conference, is amongst them, that were very aware of the Jewish fate and that of other minorities. Jews themselves play an important role in national resistance movements. They represent a very substantial minority within the French resistance, for example, but they had to accept that the movements were about national liberation. So the big oppositional groupings are organized around class and around nation, but not around race. When it came to racial minorities discriminated against by the regime, one thing that clearly distinguishes their situation from the predicament of Blacks, even before the era of mass murder, is that unlike Jim Crow or apartheid, Nazi racial policy was not about brutally ensuring unequal coexistence. Their goal was removal of the unwanted. They were not trying to ensure that a whole class of people on whose labor they depended would have an enduring inferior place in their society. They wanted to create a pure race without these people, not a well-regulated hierarchy. That doesn't mean that their policy was worse or more brutal, but it does change the conditions in which you're able to even imagine a resistance. So from the start, the Nazis imposed massive pressure on Jews to leave Germany, and the other measures are well known for time. I will jump over them. And so this is one important reason that groups that were opposing Nazi racial policy, not least Jews and other minorities themselves, had very little expectation of achieving change. The Nazis were increasingly impervious to any kind of protest. They crushed domestic opposition. The speed of their economic recovery reduced their susceptibility to international pressure. They were preparing for war with their neighbors, not seeking long-term coexistence that required compromises. And once the war began, the only way of stopping them was defeating them in the war. Now, this did not prevent national resistance movements from emerging, but it was clear to most that they could at best be a complement to or profiteer from the Allied war effort. So these facts fundamentally constrain, shape, and isolate Jewish resistance in particular. In the very early years of Nazi rule, German Jewish leaders did seek to affect the regime's stance, but they very soon realized that at the very best, they could slow this or that policy down for a limited period. And by 1935, most German Jewish leaders realized that there was no long-term future left for the community in Germany. Jews abroad, particularly in the US, sought to influence US government policy to the Nazi regime, but they were very constrained by anti-Semitism at home and the Depression. In an era of depression and isolationism, the US government's ability to look beyond its borders and to impact Nazi Germany was limited. Jews caught up within the Nazi sphere in Germany, then Austria, then in occupied areas were certainly not passive. And I just seeing a message from, was certainly not passive. And in fact, recent research has shown just how many Jews tried in some way to ameliorate their situation. Their agency, I think, is emerging. Evasion, flight, trying to make do, all sorts of communal steps, individual steps, and so on. There's a whole history being written about these. But resistance in terms of actually changing what the Nazis are doing is beyond the reach of Jews. Once the Nazis moved to mass murder, as they do during the war, particularly starting in 1941 in the Soviet Union, a major problem for Jews who nevertheless want to stand up and fight is that their timetable has suddenly become so much more urgent than that of the national movements. The national resistance movements want to shape the future of their countries once the Nazis have been defeated. They have to be very cautious with their energies and risks till it was clear that they would not be destroyed. Once it was clear that the Nazis were on the genocide path, the Jews, however, cannot wait, but found it very hard to get non-Jewish resistance, be it in Auschwitz or outside the walls of Warsaw, to accept their timetable. And this reinforces the point that the major resistance movements were not about Nazi racial policy as such, and thus that when Jews do stand up and fight, it's as much a symbolic measure of standing up and being counted, or at best a hope of creating space to escape, and not about any rational hope of actually being able to change things. So as a result of all this, a lot of recent work on opposition to Nazi race policy, and particularly to Nazi policy towards Jews, has taken the form of looking, as I say, at smaller scale measures, at evasion, at self-help, and at help and rescue by others. For those involved in sort of organized military resistance movements then and later, it was hard to see rescue as more than a distraction, since it involved taking risks without threatening the regime. In post-war celebrations of heroic resistance activity, rescue is barely remembered. It's only much later that it comes to the fore in terms of memories of what has been done. And the small group that I am going to introduce you to in a sec found it, in fact, very hard to gain recognition after the war, because the actions that they'd done to help individuals were not seen by, for example, other left-wing groups as real resistance. As the Holocaust has become more central to our understanding of Nazi Germany and the occupations, however, we've begun to see rescue as part of efforts to resist the regime's policy of trying to destroy minorities, and specifically the Jews. From this perspective, the Jews themselves, every breath taken was a kind of resistance, so total was the Nazi effort at destruction. But we need to bear in mind that the effort, the rescue work tends to be focused on individuals rather than in any way trying to dent what the policy of the regime. So we're talking about a very different kind of general context. Now, against that background, let me say, and I really will try and keep it brief in view of the way time's moved on, say a few things about this group that I've been working on and that I wrote about in my recent book, Lives Reclaimed. They call themselves the League for Socialist Life, or for short, the Bund, a word which means league. And some of you may have encountered other groups, including the Jewish Bund, but that has no connection with this one. It's a very common designation. It's a small left-wing group. At its height, it had 200 members that formed after the First World War as part of a sort of wave of efforts to imagine a new, more just society. So it forms well before the Nazi era. Though it does critique racism and folkish or ethno-nationalism, its real focus is on class, on achieving greater equality and justice in a socialist society, and also more intimately of using their community to train the members to think in such a way that their own interests and those of the community would be aligned, and thus one would be free and in harmony at the same time. In short, their agenda was a mixture of Marx and Kant, a strange combination in some ways, but there were quite a few left-wing groups in Germany and Austria with similar ambitions. So you have to think about a group that feels something a bit like a local socialist party branch, a group of 1960s alternative lifestylers, though not at all into drugs and alcohol, quite the reverse, and a Quaker meeting. Non-Jews and Jews were both present, not least because the founding couple was a mixed marriage. Arthur Jacobs, the sort of inspirational, charismatic leader, was a non-Jewish former high school teacher, now in adult education, and his wife Dora was of Jewish background. It also ended up having a lot of women in it, not least because Dora was into innovative approaches to physical movement and training, and created her own gymnastics school with a new holistic approach to the body, and that drew a lot of women to the school who also wanted to get professional training as a gymnastics teacher, and some of them were then drawn into the group. And I mention these things because recent research on rescue has shown that the capacity and willingness to aid Jews turns out to depend on characteristics often that had nothing to do specifically with the outlook or philosophy per se. One of those is that a lot of rescue networks have at their heart a couple that was in mixed marriage, or couples who were converts, who were themselves not directly targeted by Nazi measures in the same way as those who were fully Jewish were, but at the same time, and have connections into the non-Jewish world, but at the same time also have a strong awareness of what's happening in the Jewish community. And or another characteristic is that many of those involved in rescue are women. It's often women's work. Women are in charge of the domestic sphere. Women are making decisions in the house, and they're also taken a little bit less seriously by the regime, and thus have a certain scope to act. Incidentally, as many of you will know, Israel honors those who helped Jews in the Holocaust with the designation righteous among the nations. And partly as a result of that, we sort of have a clear sense of what a rescuer is. It's a morally upright individual motivated by ethical consideration who saves a life. And there really were such people, and they deserve to be celebrated and honored. And in some ways, the description fits many of the Bund members, and a number of them have now been recognized as righteous. But in other ways, it's rather misleading. And when Jews did survive as a result of help, very often more than one person would be involved along the way. In fact, help is a better word than rescue, because in the German case, for anybody to survive, it usually took a double-digit number of people to be involved, who would be sort of involved at some place along the way. Many helped, but many of the individuals did not rescue on their own. Also, the motives varied enormously. Often it involved money, though not in the Bund's case, sometimes because the helper actually wanted to make money, but also because they did not have enough resources to be able to, for example, procure food on the black market to provide the help. Sometimes it does involve genuine ethical principle, and this is the case of this group I'm looking at. But even then, personal motives, pre-existing connections, and other social characteristics are critical ingredients. The Bund is generally hostile to organized religion, and so the persecution of Jews, and they're not particularly thinking initially about religious matter. The persecution of Jews is not initially on their agenda. They're more worried about preserving themselves. They're under attack. Some members are sent to concentration camps briefly because they had been also active in the Communist Party, distributing leaflets and so on. And so the first years of the regime are spent really with them working out what it is that's wrong with the regime, what they think, and how to function under Nazi rule and surveillance. How can they deal with neighbors who may be spying on them? How do they maintain cohesion? What kind of relevance do they have in a group in which they, in a society in which it's too dangerous to reach out to others, and so on. The turning point comes with Kristallnacht in 1938, when the Nazis mount a massive assault on Jewish buildings, Jewish synagogues, Jewish institutions, and Jewish homes. And at this point, the Bund feels itself called upon to stand up and be counted. And this is the beginnings of its actions on behalf of German Jews. And I think one of the advantages of thinking about help rather than rescue as the term is that it sort of alerts us also to think about actions that may not directly be involved in saving a life, but nevertheless are important in showing a signal that take courage, and maybe a sort of testing ground for building up experience and self-confidence and so on for actions that will then actually later lead to lives being saved. And I just give you one example, and actually it's from Tove Gerson, the woman who comes to the US in 1939 and who after the war is involved in the civil rights movement in Cambridge, Massachusetts. But her husband had already left for the US. He was half Jewish, she was not. And she was staying behind to finish her training. So she happened to be still in Germany in the time of Kristallnacht, and sort of dispatched by the Bund, she seeks out a well-off couple who she knew through her husband, and braves a mob that are outside the house of this wealthy couple carrying flowers, and goes in to express her solidarity and to see what she can do. Now, as it happens, the couple was so distraught that a few days later they commit suicide. So he didn't save any lives, and he didn't reassure them enough about that there was another Germany to make them think that life was worth living. Nevertheless, that gesture took a great deal of courage, and was one of a whole series of sort of little small bits of outreach that the group does at this time, which sort of builds confidence that they can act, and of course gives them an awareness of the conditions that Jews are under. Where they really show their mettle is in 1941, when in the Ruhr region, which is where the group is based, the major deportations of German Jews into sort of ghettos in the East begin. It's at a point when the Nazis have not yet fully resolved, as far as we know, that all of them are going to be murdered, and certainly the population at home doesn't know what the fate's going to be. But it's pretty clear that life's going to be very tough, and not everyone's going to survive. And the group reaches out to those reaches out to those that they know about or those they've heard about. They offer assistance. They provide essential goods that they may need on the journey. They accompany them to the central collection points and so on. Although all of these things are quite dangerous, because the regime has already indicated that those who help Jews will be treated very seriously, but nevertheless they continue doing it. And Arthur Jacobs, who's the founder, for example, he records in his diary that he just accompanied a woman who was being deported to, as we now know, to Minsk, and she certainly won't have survived. But he records a conversation where she says how much it means to her that they've shown this solidarity. And he says to her, as he records in his diary, that in fact, in a way, he should be thanking her, because it gives them a sense of being able to get rid of at least a tiny bit of their sense of guilt of being part of this regime that's doing that. I think it was a sort of remarkable awareness of their complicity. From 1942 onwards, they begin also to reach out and help, though some Jews go underground, initially a member of the group, and then some others who are not members of the group. And of course, that involves quite complicated actions. It means finding a series of places for them to stay, working out how they can travel from one place to another, because it's too dangerous to be in one place permanently. It means organizing their rations in such a way that those who are on the run, who can't get rations anymore, can be assisted by the group, and so on and so on and so on. And for the group members and for some of those who are on the run, they also offer them a chance to continue to take part in the group meeting. So it also means giving them a kind of spiritual sense of still being part of a community, and not just a beleaguered victim on the run. And by the end of the war, the group we think has probably contributed to saving the lives of around 8 people. There weren't that many such groups. In some ways, they are, I think, give us an idea of what was essential for survival, in that very often people survive as a result of informal networks, as I say, rather than just individuals. And the sort of 3,000 or so Jews who survived living underground in Germany tend to survive because they're helped by several people and not by individuals. I think the more universal takeaway, and I will finish here, what was distinctive about the group, I think, and this does make them stand out in relation to other sort of left-wing groups, is that because they have this Kantian element to them, they'd had a sort of politics of the personal. In other words, they were never just thinking about what kind of a better society do we want to make, but they were always thinking about what do we as individuals have to do? How do we have to live as individuals in order to create the basis for a community in which we feel free and which is nonetheless an ethical community? So they had this sense of the big picture, but they also took small gestures seriously. And I think that sense of taking small gestures seriously, so that even if you felt that you could not engage in what we might classically term resistance, you could nevertheless, you had to act, and you could act on an individual basis, and those actions save lives. And so there's something about that sort of looking heavenward but focused on the here and now that I think is a model that will extend beyond the specific German case, and as it was, I think, sort of quite realistically in this sense, attuned to a situation in which it wasn't possible to change the regime, but it was possible here and there to save a life. Thank you very much.
So we're gonna take a break here, and because the caterers have to serve us the food, so we're gonna do that and then come back for Q&A. Before doing that, I just want to give us a couple things to think about, a couple threads as we're gonna come back and have a conversation. And there's so many points of potential comparison here. There's so many points of analogy that we can make. And I think the point that Mark just ended on about scale is really vital, and thinking about the role of individuals against these vast and often inhuman systems. And I'm going to give us an anecdote that we can think about as we get our food. So Robert mentioned how in 1965, Martin Luther King was invited to come to South Africa, but was denied a visa, able to come. And the year that followed, the group that had invited him, was a multiracial student group of university students, tried again. And they invited Lorraine Hansberry's former antagonist, Robert Kennedy, who was then the senator from New York, and the South African government, because of his relationship with the United States government, had a much harder time denying RFK a visa. So he came. And he gave a speech to a segregated but still progressive, in a sense, audience of South African college students that has gone down as one of his best known speeches. It's often known as the Ripple of Hope speech. And I think it's a useful event for us to keep in mind as we reflect on the role that these named individuals, who are three panelists, have brought to the fore here, the role that they played in these vast movements and contesting these systems. And in that speech, RFK, I'm just going to quote a little bit of it here. He says this: "Few will have the greatness to bend history, but each of us can work to change a small portion of the events, and in the total of all these acts will be written the history of this generation." He goes on: "Thousands of unknown men and women in Europe resisted the occupation of the Nazis, and many died, but all added to the ultimate strength and freedom of their countries. It is from numberless diverse acts of courage, such as these, that the belief that human history is thus shaped. Each time," we forgive his gendered language for the 1960s, "each time a man stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope, and crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, those ripples build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of repression and resistance." And I think that this speech, we see the fallibility of the speaker, this speech in that location, bringing together these three different locations and experiences, should give us something to think about as we get some food and then come back and engage with our presenters. Thank you all. for questions, as obviously Robert is still here. So if anyone has any questions, or anyone who is participating on Zoom has any questions, they can. And if you wouldn't mind, just the benefit of our presenters, as you ask your question, if you could introduce yourself so that we know who's speaking. Yes, please.
Yeah, my name is Kevin Steve. Library stuff. Also, how.
Oh.
All right. So my question is for both Dr. Vincent and Dr. One thing I think to try to make history real, to draw some type of parallel, and both of you are and they're vital, they have to be a vital and resistant. And so in the past, I've done things like have my students look at when Harry Belafonte goes down with Sidney Poitier in 64 to Mississippi. I think they drop off like $70,000 to sick workers. And I say that's like the equivalent of, you know, Denzel Washington and Will Smith before the Oscar incident, going down and delivering money, you know, civil rights. And we also do a thing, a correlational analysis where we look at Aretha Franklin and Nina Simone, and we look at them as the Beyonce and the Rihanna of their time period. And we look at how Nina Simone basically just sacrificed her career for the cause of resistance. So my question to both of you is, in today's time, who could I use that even remotely touches that level of sacrifice and commitment that we saw from those individuals?
Think about that one.
Can I add or share some thoughts about that? Because I think the challenge of the analogy is that all of the people you cited are people who existed in activist and artistic communities, and they were sort of socialized in those as they came of age. So if you think about anything from, you know, the Harlem Writers Guild, or even Nina Simone's close relationships with Hansberry and Baldwin, and they are, so the challenge is that those figures were involved in organizing that preceded their incredible fame, and in many ways, and was part of their coming of age. And so it's hard to find a good analogy, because it's just those types of sort of independent spaces for Black political activism in artistic community are not as robust across the board. And so I think the people that you would find who might be comparable, like maybe, I know someone like Asia Monet currently is not going to have that kind of stardom, frankly, in this landscape.
I can't say anything better than that. That's real. That's real. I mean, you know, we're reminded of that with Harry Belafonte's death, like, you know, that he said this over and over again. He just walked into activists, you know, after he became famous, but that this was who he was. And that's so right. So I think it's hard to think of anyone right now in that way. It might be that in 20 years' time, we might look back on someone who is doing this work organically and somehow becomes more famous through artistry et cetera, in some way. It could be that someone who has an art exhibit or becomes famous in a particular way, and then we become aware of their longstanding activism. We catch up in a way, right? So I think it's hard to answer that question right now, but in some time we might be able to look back and say, oh, this person or this person who was already doing that work and wasn't trying to be famous, was simply doing the work, and somehow or another, happenstance, some situation raises their prominence in such a way, right? But they've been doing all that already.
Yeah, thank you for this. It's fabulous. This is a question I think stimulated first by Robert, but I think Mark and Amani both might comment on it. Robert, you pointed out how the early creators of apartheid saw it as a reform, a method of whatever, containing, controlling the races and so on. There were Americans in the progressive era, Woodrow Wilson and the whole group that he brought to Washington to segregate the government, who saw themselves as progressive reformers. That is, Jim Crow was a reform. I'm wondering here, and then to Mark, from the Nazi example, what can we learn about this? About that transition from when something can portray itself, a system can portray itself as simply reforming society, to when it might become eliminationist, to use that old term, when it might become violent and more brutal. And I'm asking in part because of frankly, the situation we have now. We have a far right that is blurring these lines. And I'm wondering how you can all comment on how do we know when a regime is on the edge of something truly eliminationist, which all three of these were to some extent. One went further, one could say. Your thoughts?
I think in this moment of 48, there was great uncertainty within the National Party about exactly which way to go. They didn't expect to win the election. So they were sort of caught off guard, and what to do with this election slogan of apartheid. That had some recent history to it, but it wasn't a fully formulated program in any way. And so I think that what was clear, I think, amongst enough National Party leaders was we need to consolidate this victory. We need to do all we can to put forth an agenda that might guarantee a victory or increase the chances of a victory in the next election. And what I think at that moment, what they're casting about, and I think this is to the point that Mark raised in a different context, you're really trying to get a feel of the electorate. What is the electorate responding to in terms of legislation or to the language of reform? And that connection of society, particularly your electorate and political actors who might be jostling for position within the National Party, who can tap into a live wire issue. I think that's the connection. And when you say eliminating, you don't mean in the genocidal way, but you mean in the sense of removing a political threat in a way. Yeah, I think there's much more about the less. Yeah, what I feel is that it's far less top-down dynamic and much more of a attuned to what is bubbling up from an electorate and some key stakeholders within a party, and then there's movement. But I think that's the lesson that I take from these early years was the in the first couple of years, a sense of indecisiveness in a way, uncertainty.
You know, just really quickly, the question made me think of George Washington Williams, who is one of the sort of fathers of African American studies, going to the Congo Free State because he heard that it was a reform structure, right? And gets there, and he's there at the same time as Conrad. And he says this is essentially, you know, he's the person who devises the term crimes against humanity, right? So it's essentially a genocidal enterprise. I mean, he doesn't use that language yet. And that I think anytime, the lesson is that anytime you have order that is predicated on stratification, this becomes a possibility. An order that is structured around some people exist in the community without rights, right? So at any moment that you fetishize order over recognition of any members, you have the potential to tip over into unbelievable violence.
I just said, I think this is a great question. And there were observers who recognized, for example, Jewish leaders who recognized that the Nazi Party was going to be disastrous and were trying to wake others up to the threat that they represented. And there were plenty of things already before 1933. For example, there were the so-called Boxheimer papers that were released that revealed plans that were not directly implemented then, in fact, that would have been extremely rough towards Jews. So there was sort of Jewish leaders who were very aware that there was a very real threat. So in that sense, the question is not, was this regime going to progressively develop to a sort of fairly disastrous agenda, not the Holocaust, but a disastrous agenda was clear already. But I think in and this is very relevant for present times, people see what they want to see. And in the very polarized conditions of the interwar period, you know, when left-wing journalists went to the USSR, they saw what they wanted to see, and in the 30s, and they didn't see or want to see the scale of the famine that was being unleashed. And similarly, those who were fearful of the communists and were very keen for a sturdy authoritarian regime were happy to take the regime at its word that it just wanted to ensure a sort of orderly separation of the races. And even in 1935, with the Nuremberg laws, Hitler says that hopefully this will be the basis for a coexistence between Jews and non-Jews, although absolutely it wasn't what he intended. What he intended was for the Jews to be forced out of Germany, but it was language that resonated with a certain part of the population that wanted to see that this is what the regime was doing. And in fact, Jewish leaders had to respond as though they believed that was what the regime wanted, although they knew full well that it didn't. So I do think there's troubling resonances with today of in terms of what people are willing to see. And I think that's one of the things that makes some of the sort of let's say anti-democratic candidates for election at the moment so dangerous, is that there are people not willing to see what it is that they stand for, although it's very obvious.
Yeah, please.
My name is Eileen, and I was connected to the university or any educational institution. I have two questions. I'd like to know a bit more about the White Rose movement. And also, in terms of like non-heroic acts that people could take today, some people like myself maybe might be able to take. I have done some tutoring. I have here and there given some money or food or books, sometimes children's books, to individual people. including to someone who was quite hostile about the way Black Americans are treated. And I don't know how that was, I sent her a book. I don't know how that worked out. But I'm open to suggestions of what you think would be helpful kinds of things to do.
I missed the beginning of that. Was that directed to me?
The first part was.
Okay, the first part was about the White Rose. So this was sort of a group of students in Nazi Germany who were sort of increasingly courageous in terms of producing leaflets, alerting their fellow students and others to the sort of crimes of the regime, and they were eventually discovered they were the authors of the leaflets, and the leaders were executed. This was in Munich, and there's lots of things that you can find that written about them, and there are also films about them. I would say that they were taking risks, I mean, enormous risks in producing leaflets like that, in a way that the group that I was looking at would not have done. They didn't expose themselves to that kind of threat. And in fact, a lot of the destruction of the sort of left-wing groups follows from them producing leaflets, the leaflets being found and then being traced back to the authors. So those were remarkable gestures, but they were gestures that were very likely to lead to the killing of the authors, and much less likely to produce a desired reaction against the regime.
I worked in Leon Sullivan's office in DC, in his lobbying office, and as you know, he was the author of the Sullivan Principles in South Africa, and he caught a lot of pushback from the Black caucus back then because of those principles. What do you know about that?
I think for many who criticized those principles, it was precisely because it was felt that it was simply reformist and that it did not alter. It allowed foreign capital to continue to exist in South Africa. If a corporation would say, well, we will not adhere fully to apartheid policies, that we will have a kind of gentler work environment in some way, well, that might have been a step. But it did not directly engage the question of many folk who simply want to complete divestment and disinvestment, and as a way to hurt the apartheid regime, right? The feeling was removal of foreign capital, and investments, broadly speaking, were the key, not a type of reform of a workplace environment to allow foreign companies to continue to exist. And so I think that was the criticism of the Sullivan Principles for those who did not agree with them. It was not felt to be right. Yeah. Right. And that's what I think he felt that. And for many, as you said, that it is a type of step. And I think he came to fully embrace that idea that this was simply a step. And I think for many activists who did not agree with the principles, it simply did not go far enough, fast enough. Right? It did not seem to address the urgency of the situation. And so I think that was the disagreement.
We have time for just a couple more questions. We're going to break at 6:20 to allow people to take a little break before the teachers panel. So any more questions?
Can I add just one more thing to that, though, because Leon Sullivan is really, really important because he raises consciousness about what's happening in apartheid South Africa. He uses his platform to shed light. And so whenever you can raise political consciousness and expand the levels of engagement, doesn't all have to be the same, right? That you try to push on different pressure points. You come into a struggle in different ways, and one may come into a particular struggle supporting those principles in some way, but then in further engagement refines, does something slightly different, right? Or engages in debate, right? And so all of it is worthwhile, even if there's disagreement. In fact, that disagreement can be very generative, right? And so that's what I would say, that Sullivan is really important, and the principles are really important for those reasons. Even if you don't agree at the time, if folk didn't agree, you're engaging and you're raising consciousness and you're inviting more people into that arena, right? Who evolve as human beings evolve in various ways. Some might have been against it and gravitated toward it, or some of the ideas associated with it, but you're engaged, right? So that's what I would say. That's what I would add.
Any other questions for our panelists? Sure.
To any of the panel who might wish to answer. During Professor Vinson's talk, the idea came up of, or what rather was described, of honorary whites, that African Americans entering South Africa or the other way around were treated much better than the local populations in either case. Why was that done?
So in the first instance of African Americans in South Africa, mostly in the late 1890s up until about 1902, why was it done? From the perspective of the local governing authority, why was it done? Right. Well, it happens, and it's short-lived, by the way. It happens at a particular moment in time, and it happens in the 1890s. There were 2 Afrikaner republics and 2 British colonies, and this was particularly effective in the Afrikaner republics. One, because there was a moment in time when there was real concern to curry, or desire to curry favor with America. So African Americans could go to American consular officials, assert their American citizenship, and assert, their rights as Americans, that citizenship should trump race in this case. And in this brief moment of time, they were able to leverage, either through interpersonal relationships or just the idea of American citizenship, that Americans should not be subjected to discrimination of whatever color, lest it lessen the national prestige, no matter how people were treated back in the States. So there was this moment in time when diplomatically there was an opening. That closed rather quickly after the British won the South African War, and basically after 1902, that began to shift, so that by 1906, it was essentially, no, you are treated as any Black South African. So that closed. And in South Africa, in the apartheid period, that was strategic from the apartheid regime. There were other groups who were honorary whites too. Japanese were honorary whites. And then some,
Chinese.
but not Chinese, right? So there was this distinction, and something to do with the national prestige of Japan, but also its economic might and investments in the country, et cetera. But also select African Americans, the boxer Bob Foster, for instance. And there were several other African Americans who were courted, paid very handsomely as entertainers or athletes, and were kind of sheltered, right? To, basically stay in whites only areas, go to, whites only parties, and just be, deliberately courted and treated in such a way that they would not interact at all with anti-apartheid efforts. They would not be going to townships or anything like that. And they would have this sort of blinkered view, sometimes willingly. It's kind of going along with this blinkered view, and they would report back, oh, South Africa's not so bad. I had a great time, right? Now, the color that of great prominence perhaps was not Black or white, but green, because they did get exorbitant fees sometimes to be. And sometimes in places like Sun City, which was sort of was part of a homeland that theoretically, supposedly was not part of apartheid South Africa. where it was like Las Vegas, essentially, where you could engage in all types of behaviors that might have been outlawed in apartheid South Africa. So you have these spaces, right, that you can exist outside of these racial regimes in that way, but only in an individual kind of way, right? So that's the content for why it pops up. 70s and 80s.
I think we'll have to leave it at that. Please join me in thanking our panelists. So we're gonna break for 6 minutes and then come back at 6:30 for the next panel. 6 minutes.